Welcome back. You're watching News Center. Now, today, U.S. sanctions on Russian oil firms have come into effect. According to Kepler, about 50 tankers heading towards China, India, or smaller ports carrying nearly 48 million barrels of Russian crude could be stranded at sea, as most will be forced to look for alternate destinations. The sanctions target leading producers, Rosneft and Lukoil, in an effort by Washington to pressure the Kremlin to end the war in Ukraine. According to U.S. Treasury Department officials, the measures are already working, contributing to a drop in Russian oil volumes. India and China, once major buyers of Russian crude oil, are actively importing crude from other sources. Meanwhile, India's oil imports from the U.S. jumped sharply, rising to 10.7% in October 2025, up from 3% in 2024. Today, the U.S. Department of State sanctioned 2 Indian individuals and entities for their involvement in the sale of Iran's petroleum products and funding Iran's nuclear program. To understand the impact of these sanctions on India and the oil markets at large, we have with us Christoph Ruhl, Global Advisor with Crystal Energy. Christoph, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us, these sanctions take effect as of today, but the fact that the sanctions will take place and the messaging from Washington has been clear for a very long time. Give us a sense, has there been enough time for readjustment for India to reconfigure its oil supplies, or are there risks, or are there at least price constraints that India will now have to work with?
Well, as you described, we are in the middle of the adjustment process, and the oil market is a huge, big beast, and it moves very slowly, but it does move. And what we see at the moment is this 48 million barrels at high seas of oil, which has left Russian ports, and where it is not quite clear what the destination is. A lot of it goes towards India, a lot of it goes toward China. But it's safe to assume that this is an adjustment phase in which these ships will find new routes and new ways, possibly with what they did before, reloading it to other ships, switching off the transponders so that they're hard to trace. That my guess is that after a few weeks, these new routes will be established. Now, one point which has not been discussed very widely, which is important in this context, is Russia has a double problem if it doesn't manage to reroute these ships, because the winter is coming and oil production in Russia is, as you can imagine with these temperatures, weather sensitive. So if the sanctions succeed in really shutting in some of the Russian oil so that it cannot be exported and affects production volumes, then Russia has a problem, because it will be very difficult to ratchet that up later on when it freezes over, when the systems cannot be kept alive and through the winter.
Sure. From an Indian perspective, Christoph, help us understand what are the alternatives that India is looking at. Very recently, we saw an announcement that 10% of LPG will be procured from the United States. That's clearly an indication, messaging from between Washington and Delhi. So going forward, what direction do you think India's alternatives will take? What are the options that India has on the table?
Well, at this point, one has to make two distinctions. One is between what's actually happening and political messaging, so such as we will in future import everything from the US. The other is very important, of course, between crude oil and refined products. And what we have here is that India has, since the invasion of the Ukraine, ratcheted up its crude oil imports from Russia, so that's raw oil, tremendously, and has then started to put that into its refineries and refined, as you know, part of which was consumed domestically, and replaced crude oil, which was before imported mostly from Asia. That's from the Middle East. Sorry, not from Asia, from the Middle East. And part of it was re-exported and sold with the little profits, which had the Americans so upset. What we are seeing right now is a concentrated move from India to rent ships, shipping capacity at driving prices up very high now, from the Middle East in order to replace some of this Russian crude oil. So that's a clear indication that substitution is taking place, that India is not just talking about it, but is taking crude oil from the Middle East to replace Russian crude oil. On the front of refined products, we have seen that the crude oil prices globally are under pressure, partially also because there's all this Russian crude oil still coming out, still floating around, but not having a home yet. Whereas on the other hand, refined products, in particular mazout, this is diesel from Russia, which was one of the biggest, if not the biggest global supplier, has increased in price because of the Ukrainian attacks on Russian refineries. So there one has to distinguish, and India is there not in a particular advantageous position because...
Christoph, I just have one more follow-up question. That while India is managing these alternate options, What happens on the pricing front? How much significantly of a premium will now India have to shell out for buying non-Russian oil?
So at the moment, during this adjustment process, the discount for Russian oil is, of course, much wider than it was. But in general, the global markets are so well supplied, and before the latest round of sanctions, the discount for Russian oil had almost evaporated, so that I would not expect the bill for India to go up significantly if it replaces the Russian crude oil or most of the Russian crude oil with Middle Eastern oil.
Fair enough. And one final question to you. There are efforts underway for a resolution of the Ukraine-Russia crisis. There's a US-backed plan that's underway, involves Ukraine giving up some territory. Any traction on the ground that you see for the peace plan? And are the oil markets accommodating that, factoring that in?
Yeah, that's the thing between political messaging and what actually happens. I don't think it's an accident that the sanctions start on the 21st of November, and on the 20th of November, the leakage occurs that there is a new peace proposal being made. I see two things. I see this as a signal that sanction enforcement will be pretty lame in the tradition of the Trump administrations all along, that they are not prepared to take hard measures against Russia. That's also visible in the peace plan. And I see that another step in this chewing gum, this long drawn out process, which will not lead to a lasting peace, because the new plan, which has been leaked, is containing a lot of provisions the Ukraine will not be able to accept, such as the withdrawal from land which is currently still holds.
Right, Christoph, thanks so much for joining us. Multiple moving parts there. We'll, of course, keep track of those developments within India and outside as well. Christoph, thank you so much for joining us, being a part of this conversation. But that's all that time that we have. It's a wrap on this edition of News Center. More news and updates will continue right here on CNBC TV 18.